Temperature. So temperature has lots of different effects on exercise, and it can make it so much more difficult if it's out of the optimum temperature. It can be potentially dangerous to performers, especially if they're performing in the extremes, so this is extreme heat or the extreme cold. Essentially, it will just affect the way how hard the heart works and what areas of the body can work and which ones can't. So an example of athletes performing in the heat would be the Rio World Cup, where the games were arranged to be in the evening and had opportunities to have 15-minute breaks anywhere within the game, just so the players could get some water and hydrate themselves. An example of sport being played in the cold would be in the Winter Olympics. That's like skiing and all the cold sports which are done in the snow. But also Premier League football clubs, they'll have their training in the cold, so when they play in season they're used to it. Within the assignment we did an experiment which focused on the resting heart rate and exercise heart rate in heat and when using cooling aids and normal body temperatures, as like obviously, as well as exercising cold weather, using a cooling aid would have the same or similar effects on performers when they are performing. So basically, homeostasis controls the internal conditions of the body to keep conditions at an optimum level. It's like scales, so if the body gets too hot, it cools it down. If it gets too cold, it warms it up. It's done by receptors, which will monitor the changes to keep equilibrium, and the effectors initiate change by triggering a response, and then obviously there'll be a negative feedback loop, which is if it's too hot, then it gets colder, and vice versa. So regulating the temperature in the body. So if it's too hot, the involuntary responses would be that the thermoreceptors detect temperature change. These can be the peripheral ones in the skin, and they'll be sent to the hypothalamus in the brain. And the receptors will send this message to the thermoregulatory center, which is the hypothalamus. It will be an automatic response, and it will travel down the adreneric neuron. This response will be to vasodilate the precorpus sphincters, which relax the muscular layer surrounding the lumen and expand it, so more blood can flow through, which lowers the blood pressure, causing the blood to have less pressure as it's flowing through the veins, so it cools the body down a bit. Another involuntary response would be sweating. This is when the hairs flatten to trap less heat, and the sweat glands will release more fluid for evaporation. It's less effective in moist conditions, as there's less of a concentration gradient for the water to be released from the skin. The voluntary responses to being too hot, convection. So this is when you'll use a cool thing to cool you down. So if I'm too hot, I'll get a cold towel and put it on my head. You can take off clothes and slow down. So if you're running and you're really hot, you'll just naturally, you won't naturally slow down, but you can voluntarily take the pace down a bit to prevent yourself overheating. And conduction, which is similar to convection, of using cold objects to cool you down, to offload the heat onto a different area. So if you're cold, the involuntary response would be that the thermoreceptors detect the temperature change, and this will again be in the peripheral receptors, which are in the skin, and the internal ones, which are in the hypothalamus in the brain. A message will be sent to the thermoregulatory center in the brain, which is in the hypothalamus, and an autonomic response will be sent down the somatic neuron. So this can either be shivering, which is when skeletal muscles are stimulated to contract to cause you to shiver, which generates heat, or it can be pilaricration, which is when the hairs on your body stand up to trap the heat, or it will be vasoconstriction of the precapillary sphincters, which stimulate to make the muscle layer in the capillaries constrict to reduce the size of the lumen and increase the blood pressure and prevent the blood from coming through, which having an increased blood pressure generates heat because more force is being used to push the blood through. The voluntary response would be putting a jumper on, moving around a bit more, and convection, but by using warm objects to warm you up. So there are sicknesses which can occur from being in the heat or in the cold. So one of which would be dehydration. This is the excessive loss of fluids in hot temperatures. So 80% of this is by the evaporation of sweat, and it can cause impaired performance. It can cause your muscular work to decline, heat exhaustion, hallucinations, and potentially a collapse of circulatory system and heat stroke, which is like cooking from the inside. And all these effects will worsen as you get hotter. You could also get hypothermia, which is a condition when the body is above its normal temperature. This can cause muscle cramps, profuse sweating, thirst, fatigue, headaches, chills, and goosebumps. Also, it causes you to feel sick, a mass amount of sweating, confusion, loss of consciousness, and possibly can lead to death. The sicknesses which can occur in the cold are hypothermia. So this is when the body's internal temperature is below normal. So if it gets below 1 to 2 degrees Celsius below, then it's known as acute or immersion, and it's like falling into cold water. If you get 2 to 4 degrees centigrade below your normal temperature, you'll become exhausted, and then 4 degrees below your normal temperature can lead to chronic hypothermia, which is just you just get progressively worse, like feeling sick, shivers, your blood can't circulate properly. So the effects that cold has on the body, that heat and cold can have on the body. So the heat causes you to have an increased heart rate. This is because your heart has to work harder to pump the blood to the working muscles, as they're just in a more they're in a state where they're finding it difficult to contract, so they'll use more energy. There'll be a decrease in blood pressure because of vasodilation. There'll be an increase in evaporation and sweating, and there will be the vasodilation of precapillary sphincters. If it's cold, your heart rate will increase. This will be because the vessels have constricted. The heart needs to pump more blood through them, and it has to do this. It has to increase the amount of beats it's doing to increase the amount of blood that gets around. Therefore, there'll be an increased blood pressure because the heart is trying to pump blood for a smaller space, which just increases the pressure it's being pumped through. The enzymes in your body will denature. So enzymes have an optimum temperature, and in a similar way, if your body temperature is too hot, they'll denature. If it's too cold, they'll denature, so they won't be able to break substances as easily, and this can have an effect on your body when it's exercising, as like chemical reactions which normally can't take place because the enzymes aren't in the right temperatures to do so. It will cause sleepiness just because your body is working harder, so you're using more energy, and your skin can go cold and pale because of vasoconstriction. And some people have the illness Raynaud's, which is when your blood cannot circulate to the extreme. So I get it when my fingers completely die off and they'll go white, and I can't feel them or use them whilst they're white, and then eventually the blood comes back. But it's not very pleasant. So the effects that temperatures can have on your performance. So the heat can cause confusion and fainting, just because there's not enough blood getting to where it needs to be. The blood's going to the muscles rather than to your brain, so it causes you blood pooling and everything can take place. And your body and muscles are competing for this oxygenated blood, which is what I mentioned about the blood pooling. Oxygen is needed to help the body to cool in the muscles, but it's also needed in the brain to keep the body functioning. So that's why fainting can occur. In the cold, the effects on performance will be muscle or tendon tears, just because they're not warm enough. So when they're stretched, they'll just rip instead of stretch. You can fatigue much quicker because your body is just using so much more energy to keep your body warm. Your coordination will be poor because your neural system is sending messages just at a slower rate because it's not optimal temperature. You can become disorientated just because the blood is trying to get everywhere in your body to keep it warm. You can possibly have cardiac arrest because your heart's working too hard to circulate the blood. So in order to adapt to conditions, athletes will train in environmental chambers which try to replicate certain temperatures so your body can adapt to the change. So a lot of African runners, a lot of British runners will train in environmental chambers to stimulate high temperatures, which is what African runners run in to give them, not head start, but like an advantage when they're competing against them. You can also, so an example of when athletes would use this would be in like the desert marathon, which is the Marathon des Sables, where athletes will train in the hotter conditions, so they're more likely to get a better time in the race. This marathon is literally brutal. They're running through a desert, competing against the extremes as well as the temperatures. It is pretty mad. Very hot conditions. And also like the North Pole Marathon, so athletes will train in colder conditions to be more likely to do it, just so their body can get used to exercising in such a severe temperature, and they can work out what clothing they need and everything. So as I mentioned, we did an experiment and the results are on here as followed. So the heart rate in the normal conditions is shown in orange on this graph, and then the heat is shown in grey. So the rest, this is at rest, so when you compare the normal temperature to the temperature in heat, the heart rate is much higher in the heat, and the t-test showed this was a significant difference because it was 0.00. In the blue here I've put the mean of both, so as you can see the mean is much higher in the heat. I also looked at the RP of the athletes. This increased in the heat as well, so the heat is the normal temperature is in blue, the heat is in orange, and then this is the average. So the t-test showed this to be significant because it was 0.018. Significance, it was 0.05. This just basically shows that the participants in the experiment found it so much harder, well not so much harder, but obviously significantly harder to exercise in the hottest conditions compared to the normal ones. This graph here shows the RPE during the heat exercise. This one was during rest. And the RPE wasn't as significant. The t-test didn't show that this was a significant difference because it was above 0.05, so we found it to be 0.182. This might be because like the participants were still working hard when they were exercising, but if you look at individuals you can see it's a difference. So this one here, subject 7, they found that in the heat it was a 16, but then in the cold it was a 13, which is significantly different. And if you look at each individual ones here as well, they found it much harder. It might just be because of this participant and this one that the t-test didn't come out as significant. So we also did